part of the sunny UK you're from at the moment, and indeed if you're beyond the UK, a big welcome as well. Brexit may take place, but we still, at Future Teacher, we love all our European neighbours and partners. So this is about the wonderful world of webinars, and just in terms of if we look at the next slide, and you'll have access to all these slides in a minute, but just by way of introduction, we can think of webinars as technology. Is not really about technology. It's about magic. It's about making space disappear so that people from vastly different locations can get together synchronously, asynchronously, etc. There are sometimes implications with time zones and all sorts, and I've taken part, as I'm sure a number of people have, where you have a webinar really late at night or really early in the morning because the other participants are in other parts of the world. But it is actually a tremendously rich pedagogical source of innovation and support for students, and we'll explore these. The other panels here you can look at later in your own time. Just to say, this is the 17th webinar, and we're very pleased with that. And you can look at any of the others. They're all recorded, and we've got these sort of resources for all of them. This session, we are going to try to keep it to time. We always try to keep it to time. And the we that I'm talking about is Lillian, myself, Alistair, and Ron. And we'll tell you more about the Future Teacher project at the end of the session, and you can then take part in some of the learning journeys, if you like, with that. So that's the welcome. We'd like you at this point now, and we'll, in the text chat pane is a link. If you prefer to have a nice, easily memorable link, then there's a short link there, learningapps.co.uk/webinars. That will open up the same resource that we're using. The reason for that is because we want you to have access to everything, so it's not going to be a transient experience that disappears immediately afterwards. You will have access to all of it, but also we want to involve you in some activities, and so you will need to have your own version. So if you have got that open, I suppose I could at this point say put your hand up, but I'm not going to. Let's just make sure we can move on to the next slide. And this is going to take you through our workflows, but I think this is a Ron one.
Yeah, we, again, as Alistair mentioned, this resource is full of self-access information that you can access in your own time after the webinar. But we want to pick out a few things about our workflow, and each of these elements here have hotspots attached to them with that extra contextualization. So we usually start with some kind of initial planning meeting for these webinars and what we're going to do. And then you can see as we go through, we brainstorm the content, and we use mind mapping and various tools and so on. One of the things I wanted to mention is that as a final step of this kind of planning phase, we use a Google spreadsheet, and there's a link here to download your own copy of that. And so when you follow that link, what you'll get to is a prompt to make your own copy with your own Google account. And when you do that, just very quickly, hopefully that's going to do that, what you'll get to do is this spreadsheet. And what you can do is you can add whatever you've got in different pages. And then as soon as you change the time, so let's say what I've typed in there was 10 minutes, the times below and the total will update. And this is what we do to effectively work through the timings, and it's why our timings are quite tight. As you go through this, you'll see that you can tab through as well, and it will go through, but it will stop at this point and go to the research phase, and then go to the deliver webinar phase. And then our job after this webinar still isn't done, because we then manage the cloud recordings and reflect on it and build our journeys and then plan for the next session. So this is a resource you can look at our workflow and quite a lot of detail of what we do and how we do it, and access that in your own time. We usually collect what people have said during registration that they most want to learn. Again, you can read this in your own time. For those that registered late after the kind of 9 o'clock this morning, your comments might not be in here, but those that registered before and commented, they will. And we also use a mind map, and I think Lillian was going to tell you about this.
Yeah, just to say that we usually embed a mind map in, this is part of our thought process when we're designing webinars. So not just on the topic of webinars, for all the webinars we've ever run, we always kind of pile all our thoughts into a mind map. We have an online meeting, and we actually kind of shape our thinking. Then we also look at what the registrant, delegates have said, and that affects what we put into the session as well. So we kind of cater for yourselves as well as kind of having our own experiences to bear. But feel free to go in and explore the mind map. We also talked about the fact that we wondered how many people actually bother. You know, the bottom right, you can see it says copy and edit map, that people, if they did use MindMeister, might be able to kind of copy the maps and then develop it from there as well. Yeah. Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, mind mapping is just how Alistair and I do a lot of our thinking, I guess, so that works very well for us. So next, we want to involve you in a little poll. We wondered, for those of you who are here, there's 37 of us, how often you've attended webinars and how often you've run webinars. So you can actually interact not with the screen, not with the webinar screen, but with your copy of the learning object, and this is directly onto a particular page, and Alistair has popped it in the text chat. So what you can do, and Ron has, so you can select that
Ron's
link.
is better.
Yes, more accurate. Click on Ron's link. That will take you straight to the Mentimeter.
It will.
And you can select how many webinars you've attended, approximately, how many you've run or hosted, approximately. Hit submit, and then go to the next page in the resource, not on the Mentimeter itself. So the Mentimeter will ask you for an email. You don't need to put your email in. So that's clearly Ron has attended and run over 50 webinars. Look at that. That's very interesting. That's a very interesting outcome there. We've got quite a mix. So we don't have people who maybe haven't attended very many and hosted a lot. I would actually put myself in that top left quadrant. I haven't entered my details. I think I attend a lot less than I host, funnily enough. But it's quite a good mix, but there's quite a few people there who haven't attended very many and who haven't hosted very many either. And then there are quite a few people who maybe attend less than they host, shall we say. But that's quite an interesting mix. But on the whole, we can see that the majority of people haven't hosted as much as they've maybe attended. And there's a small quadrant there that maybe could benefit from working through this webinar with us, because we have quite a lot of resources, quite a lot of tips and tricks built up from all our experience and expertise. And of course, we have our guests and case studies as well. Right, thank you very much. 33 responses, that's really good. So over to Ron. Okay,
we wanted to talk through a few of the features and again, mindful of the responses there and the mixed audience in terms of experience of hosting and so on. We used a Mentimeter poll there, an external poll. What we wanted to just very quickly explore is the built-in polls, in this case to Zoom that we're using, but the similar features will be available in most webinar systems. So we're going to just very quickly load up a poll. I'm going to do that and launch the poll in, and there's two questions. There's a single answer, single choice question, or single question, single choice, and then a multiple answer question. So if you can respond to both of those, and Lillian and Alistair might need to tell me when there's been a full set of responses, although I've just seen that there's at least one response now. So, and then we can reveal the results, and you'll be able to get an idea of experience of attending our future teacher webinars, as is listed in the second question.
It's interesting that the poll starts from, there's a list and it starts from number 7.
I did that because that's webinar 7. There's actually only scope for having 10 answers. So
okay, so that's an interesting teaching point in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, to explore all the features before you actually use them is quite valid. So I've submitted.
I've submitted, yeah.
I had to say most of them because there was one where I had to miss, or maybe two, one or two where I was so ill I couldn't talk.
But I can't see the results at the moment. So I think
I need to end the polling and
okay,
share the results. And at the moment, we've got 20 out of 38, so 57% voted.
So Amy's pointed out that on this polling tool as well, if you don't tick anything in that second question, Ron, you can't submit. So we almost need to have an option which is none.
Okay, yeah.
That's very interesting, and that's again, it's nice learning curve for everybody here to be aware of these quirks of some of the features.
Okay. We are running to a tight schedule. There's 23 of 38 responses, but forgive me, I'll end the polling so that I can share the results, and you'll get an idea of how this works, at least in Zoom.
And for those that, just to reiterate, for those that weren't able to submit, it's because you had to answer all the questions. So that's an interesting part of the design, and also communicating to people that sometimes there's things below the screen. So there's the answers.
So I'm sharing the response there. And you can see I've got the ability to relaunch the polling and also to stop the sharing.
9%. First Future Teacher webinar. Welcome. 1, 2, yeah. Okay, that's lovely.
Okay, I should probably screenshot that as well so that.
Cool.
Okay, so I'll stop sharing the results there. So that's the built-in polling to Zoom that we're using. You'll have already explored the text chat, and again, this is a resource where we put more comments and more info that you can view in your own time. There's a reference to chat pods that Zoom doesn't have, but other tools do, and Alistair has some experience of using those. We've mentioned the participant list already, and again, there's some comments there. One of the things we wanted to quickly try, which is not something we've used during these Future Teacher webinars very much, is the Whiteboard tool. So on your screen, you should be able to select Annotate, and you'll see this little toolbar here that I'm circling. And what we'd like you to do is just put a tick somewhere on the map as to where you are, just to try out the Whiteboard tool and to see how that works, or scribble anything. And the important thing when you're done is to click the little red X in that toolbar that you've selected to then return your kind of normal mouse control and to stop the annotation.
So if you cannot see the annotate, hover your mouse near the top of your screen in my case, and under View Options, there is an Annotate button. But depending on your layout, it might be near the bottom. So you need to look under View Options, I think, and then Annotate.
Yeah, I found it at the View Options at the top on my one.
And we've got a good mix of responses. I'm not sure whether the ticks in the grey area representing people across the rest of the world and outside the UK, or whether they're just people exploring the tools.
There's way more people in Yorkshire for sure. I'm going to put some extra dots in Yorkshire just to show how, you know, how active we are. So you see, you can cheat when you're doing a whiteboard exercise. But there are reasons, there are very valid reasons to use a whiteboard exercise sometimes. I know the last time I used Collaborate, I knew it wouldn't record or show. It wouldn't record any polling that I did. So I used the whiteboard instead and got people to tick their options so it was visible to everyone. Ron, Debbie also had a question about whether the polling comes with the free version of Zoom. I'm not sure if it does.
I think you or Alistair will be better placed to answer that than me. I'm
Yeah.
using the paid-for version.
I haven't found it, but that doesn't mean to say that it isn't there hiding somewhere. But I certainly haven't found it.
I do know it's not obvious where it is, and that you do have to create the poll attached to each meeting that you set up. So one of the things that we realized is we tested this little poll that we've done today in my own meeting room, and I had to create the poll again to make it available in this particular meeting room that we're using for the webinar. So that's a kind of little niggling thing that ideally you should be able to create a central store of polls and reuse them whatever room that you're in. But
my bird.
That's Alistair's bell. Okay. We're using audio so you can see that, and we were going to possibly turn on our webcams, but you get the idea of how that works in Zoom, so we won't do that. The one thing we wanted to talk about very quickly is the alternative formats. And I'm going to clear the annotations, clear all the drawings, and just pick on the fact that actually we need to link this in, Lillian. I didn't have the link to which resource you wanted to use, but
sorry, I do.
There's a reference to the fact that we use Padlets and Tricida and Answer Garden and Mentimeter, and some of those we're using today later on in the session as well. And one of the key points about that is that those activities can happen before and after the webinar as well, rather than most of the webinar tools can only really happen when you're live in the webinar. So it's kind of key point and key difference as to the way we facilitate activities pre and post webinar, not by using the webinar tools, but by using additional tools. Alistair.
Yes, I said at the beginning that it's not about technology, it's really about magic, but it's also about humans. And the key thing that we believe passionately and that we see in webinars that work is that you actually feel engaged as a human. So here are just a few simple tips, and I just put it as the 4 N's that we try to use. And so there's the naming, and you'll have noticed as you've come in, we're welcoming people, saying hi, and asking people to put a little bit about themselves. I've been in lots of webinars where you don't even have a chat pane, or you can't see other people in the chat pane. You can only put a link directly or a comment directly to a presenter. Don't like that. It makes me feel very isolated. Nurturing. There's different ways in which you can nurture, and again you can look through there, making sure that the latecomers have the vital links, that you put things in later. People can feel insecure because it can be a lonely feeling, so do make sure that you clarify that sometimes if there's loads of comments coming in, you can say, well, we won't necessarily answer all of them. It doesn't mean it's not a valid comment, it means that we've just run out of time. Nagging is good in the right kind of way. You do need to make sure people don't follow the temptation to think, I'm invisible, I'll disappear and do emails. So you heard earlier Ron was saying things like, well, we had 60% of people done a response yet, anybody else got to come. So nagging's good, and depending on your context you might get the naughties. And it might be unconscious. We often deal with where there's a microphone open and somebody's chatting away and they don't realise that everybody's listening. Probably not in HE so much, but in some contexts, FE and others, you can have deliberate destructive things. You need to be clear how you're going to manage that, and it's part of the planning that you need to do. So keep humans at the heart of it, and I think that leads us fairly nicely on to the next element, which is a quick task for you to do. And Ron will show you how to do this if you're on that link. And again, if you haven't got it, we'll drop that in for you.
It's done.
It's done, thank you very much. And there's not necessarily, you will get it ticking if you've got all the right answers. When it says all the right answers, that means the right answers as I put them in. There is scope for you being able to say, actually, I think there's a good argument that this could apply equally in a different category. So, and again, that's one of the great things about being able to work with additional tools that aren't just built in the webinar. You can have new kinds of interactivity. But the key point here is not really the interactivity. It's really about the fact that there are people going to take part in your webinars who will have access needs, and you need to think about that beforehand. So let's just see how Ron's done. Ron, he is so clever. He's got it all right. If you didn't get quite as many right as Ron did, then that's fine. You've probably got good arguments, and it's the thinking and the arguing that's important. But what I want you to take away from that is think about these different people. The next slide will show us how we might think about them. So when it comes to planning your webinars, you need to be planning inclusively. So there's a few elements here, and again, I'm going to go quite fast because you can come and visit this in your own time and reflect and kind of think about how it affects your own practice, but be explicit. So there's no point in expecting you'll be able to meet people's access needs if you haven't actually given them a chance to tell you what they might be. So be explicit in the sign-up registration stuff. Keep it actively simple. Now, by the actively simple, I mean exactly both of those. Keep it active, not completely didactic, but keep it simple. So don't have so many windows open that they don't know whether they're in the Google form or the answer garden or the Padlet at the moment. And that's why we use Xerti to hold everything together. So really, you should only have two windows open, the Zoom window and the Xerti window. Keeping the content accessible is important, because if people need your source slides either to follow up or maybe needing them in advance because there's perhaps a hearing issue or whatever it might be, then if they are accessible slides at the beginning, you've helped somebody. If you send them some slides that are completely inaccessible, that's not very helpful. Making sure there's value for all. It's the next three here, the expectations. These are subtle and they are nuanced and they are important, but make sure that you don't kind of destroy the webinar for everyone because there's one person in it that needs it delivered a particular way, which is helpful to them, but actually in the process creates massive barriers for loads of other people. You need to think through and discuss compromises. Be clear on expectations, clarify what people might or might not need to do, and be transparent. Because if, for example, if today Lillian was reading out, as I speak, if Lillian was reading out everything on the text chat every 2 minutes, some of you might think that's really distracting, it's really slowing me down. But if at the beginning we said, we've got somebody on the session that isn't able to access the text chat, so every couple of minutes we're going to stop and just summarize where we've got. That transparency gives a sense of community and a sense of purpose to the accommodations. So that was the planning stage. When it comes to the presenting stage, and again, I won't go through all of these, but there's a bunch of what we think are good ideas and things that we've tried to implement either in these sessions or in other sessions that we've done. Perhaps one of the key things in there is having a spare facilitator, because doing a webinar entirely on your own is a little bit close to the edge sometimes, because it means it's hard for you to respond to individuals who might have individual difficulties or needs. So the rest of those you can come back and look at in your own time. The final bit I wanted to just cover was to make sure we've looked at the pre-webinar, the planning bit, we've looked at the presentation bit. Let's look at the post-webinar support, because I've been to many webinars where at the end of the webinar, that's it, they shut down the screen and you have lost everything. It was a transient moment in time, and if you haven't got your own notes, you've got nothing. And what we try to do is we try to make sure that at the end of the session, you've got access to the Xerti resource, and that's this is a screenshot from one of our previous webinars. So the top one with the fish and the tree is the actual link to the Xerti resource. Below that is the link to the recording, and then below that is downwards normally, but I'm having problems steering my glamorous assistant. Down at the bottom of the page, down at the bottom of the page, he's had another delivery, another DSL parcel. You can see there's the text chat as well. So we've tried to have that post-webinar support for everyone. So what we're going to do now, that's trying to make it inclusive. Let's now shift to what it's like in the presenting, and Ron's going to talk through his setup, I think.
Yeah, well, Alistair, you mentioning glamorous assistant. One of the problems I have, because I'm often the one doing the sharing of my screen and navigating, is that does mean that it's quite difficult to monitor and contribute to the text chat at the same time. So that's quite a challenge. We did. We've each got one of these kind of representations of our setup. A photograph and then some hotspots that you can again explore in your own time. We're all using laptops for various reasons. I think we've all got a picture of a mouse and a picture of a drink of some sort. I have the luxury of most of the time being in a controllable environment, so I've got 3 screens and some acoustic soundproofing, and I'm able to use a mic rather than the headset, which gives me more freedom and to a certain extent higher quality. But you know, these are all things that you can again read about in your own time. If I move on to Alistair's, one of the differences with Alistair's is, as well as the loft light that he's got coming in there, is the mirrors, and actually surprisingly for 2 purposes: one to kind of reflect the light, and also one for what you might describe as vanity, I think, Alistair, or good
glamorous,
Alistair.
Yeah, it's just saving myself from embarrassment.
Yeah.
Not 1 mirror, but 2.
Yeah, 2 mirrors. Yeah. And then if we look at Lillian's, very different, because it's a pop-up webinar studio, as she's called it, and there isn't any what do they call it on programs, kind of product placement. So ignore the branding on the shopping bag, but a key point that Lillian wanted to mention was that it's very mobile, and she has to cart it in a bag of some sort from her office room to a quieter room, and that's quite a reality check for a lot of people, that if you do join and you're using your microphone from an office environment, it's often too noisy to be suitable, particularly if you're delivering rather than just participating. And I think Alistair also, or Lillian was keen to mention the multi-bot being a really valuable or invaluable tool, because you don't really want to be using your laptop in a battery and have that run out mid-session. Did you want to talk about the various webinar software, Lillian?
Oh, this is one of those that we inserted, and we said we were going to kind of be very quick. We're conscious that a lot of people who signed up talked about, curious about what kind of tools are out there. And you can tell from the early bit when you were doing the poll, people are kind of curious about the technology as well. But we brainstormed all the ones that we knew of in like 1 minute, and there are loads out there. That's almost a problem, because you can be paralyzed by the number of different tools out there. But most of the organizations that we know will have a supported tool, so always start with that one, I would say. But then other considerations, like whether or not you can run that with your distance learners in other countries, that's something else to consider as well. So for instance, I only just found out that Zoom isn't that accessible from United Arab Emirates, which I didn't know. So there you go.
It's also worth quickly mentioning that although we've used the term webinar, we're talking generally about virtual meeting software, conferencing tools, that full collection. And Skype is one of them, which isn't often referred to as a webinar tool, but has the same functionality, really.
And it's now over to our guest speaker, Amy, and Ron will give her remote access to his PC. And this is, again, another feature. Some webinar tools have, systems have the ability to give over remote control to other presenters, and some systems don't. So it's something to look out for. But Amy will talk you through her slides.
Okay, hello, am I coming through all right?
Indeed, yeah.
Lovely, okay, great. So yes, hello, I'm Amy. I work at the University of York with Lillian, and I'm also the co-lead of the Blackboard Mobile and Collaborate user group, Collaborate being another webinar platform just like Zoom that we're using today. So I've done some of this stuff before and hopefully know a little bit about it, and I've been given the great subject of ways to ruin a webinar, which the MoCA members have loved, and it's a great way to get stuck into this subject. So, okay, slowly moving through. Okay, so who can ruin a webinar? Basically, anyone that's involved has the power to ruin a webinar if they try hard enough and they're given the right access. And obviously there's lots of different webinar platforms out there, so different platforms will have different roles and names for the roles, but I've just tried to break this down into general categories. So you've got organisers, presenters and attendees. I think they're like sort of standard categories of people involved. So your organisers are the ones that are doing things behind the scenes. They're setting up the room, making sure everything's hopefully prepared and ready to go. And their main roles are making sure the space is set up as needed and making sure that everyone can get to the space and use it properly. Then you've got the presenters who are presenting any kind of material in the webinar. And you might have an organiser that's also a presenter, you might not. And yes, the presenters are, they need to create and structure the material, and then they need to deliver that material in the webinar. And then you've got the attendees, who's basically everyone else, like yourselves listening in today, anyone that's a part of the audience on a webinar. And they should hopefully be listening attentively, interacting and asking questions when they're unsure. Okay, and remember that all of these people could be anywhere across the globe. They might be sat in the same room like me and Lillian are, or they could be anywhere. So. Okay, so quick activity for you guys. You've got 30 seconds as of very shortly. To try and put some things in chat, have a think, ways of ruining a webinar from organizer, presenter, or attendees. I'll just start the timer on my phone here. So feel free to type away and give me some suggestions, and we'll have a quick look. Forgetting to advertise in advance, that's great. Too much background noise, leaving your mic unmuted, asking too many questions, loving all of these. Slides up too long, talking over the top of each other. Yeah, I think it's very easy to think of ways that people can ruin a webinar. Okay, great, that's your 30 seconds up. I've got to keep going. That'll be to behave myself. Okay, so that's great. As you can see, there's lots of different ways that people can cause chaos and make things difficult. So I've got a few different boxes here that we won't go through them all in detail, but here's some examples, and they're very similar to the things that you've just mentioned in the chat. So the organizer is perhaps the person who can cause the most problems. They can't, maybe they don't configure the webinar appropriately. You've got a webinar with 200 people in it and they can all use voice chat because it's not been turned off, and then people just talk and it's horrendous. Maybe they send the wrong joining information out, like the second point there, or they send it really late. They don't share guidance on how to use the platform, so people don't know what they're doing or how to use the chat, things like that. Using an inappropriate platform, some of them will only accept up to 50 people in a session without prior organization and things like that. So the organizer's got all these kind of things to consider about. The presenters also got a lot on their plate. They need to make sure that they're planning their session and designing their materials with, whilst thinking about the platform's constraints. Collaborate, that we use a lot, doesn't let you really share PowerPoint presentations that have animations in. So if you've got bullet points that come up one at a time, you actually have to do quite a bit of a faffy workaround to get that to work, and things like that. So you need to have all these things in mind. You also need to keep your audience in mind, to follow up on what Alistair was saying earlier. You don't want to have text-heavy content or small fonts, or allowing time for people to ask questions, or having no interaction or inappropriate interaction, trying to get hundreds of people to write in a Google Doc at the same time, and these kind of things. And don't practice in advance and use in inappropriate locations. And then the final box is just things that everyone can cause chaos by doing. So using inappropriate equipment, using an ancient browser or a microphone that's terrible, or being distracting or acting inappropriately by spamming things. So different platforms will have different ways they can be ruined, but those are some nice sort of general ones. Okay, so what can we do about this? And again, it's going to depend on the platform that you're using, but some general guidance that's helpful is for planning. Organizers, they need to scope the requirements as early as possible. A presenter comes to them saying, I want to do this thing. They have to make sure they know what they're doing. You've got to make sure that support materials for the platform and the webinar are available, that they're there. Provide templates for standard things. So we've got a joining instruction email template that contains all the basics. We've got welcome slides that we have up on screen explaining how to use the tool when people join a room. These kinds of things. When it comes to running, we've already mentioned this in the chat today, but have multiple people involved. So you've got one person at least having a look at the chat while other people are doing the presenting and so on. And with evaluation, just look at what you can, look at how something went, what went wrong, what went right, and learn from that and develop. So there's loads of links here, but I will let you have a look at those in your own time. And that's all of my slides, really. Sorry, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but happy to take some questions in chat if people want.
I think the how to ruin a webinar sets a very good tone for all the checklists that we've created there, Amy. And I think from the chat pane, a lot of people were also voicing unique things that were coming from their own experiences that I think are quite valid that we might want to add to this summary.
No, that's great. I'll take a note of all the bits and pieces that have been said in chat, so thank you.
It is quite tough if you're new to webinars to come to one of our webinars, because I think we try to make it quite active and interactive. And I'm in two minds. Sometimes I quite enjoy webinars where the speaker's just droning on and I can just interact in the chat pane with other delegates. And at other times, I actually stop interacting in the chat pane unless the presenter wants me to, because I'm so focused and I'm so interested in what they're saying. So it's quite interesting. Okay, so thank you very much, Amy. We have put in there in the resource 2 case studies from different tutors who use webinars. Fiona at the university does a hybrid webinar, and it's quite interesting. She recently took to using the webinar tool for her polling and her kind of interactive answering question tool as well, instead of using something like a voting tool. And then on the next page, we have one from Teresa, who is one of our long-time attendees and has presented several times on our webinars as well. So she's got a lot of experience and expertise on running virtual communities. So quite a lot of good expertise in there for you to explore in her case study.
The nice thing that's worth mentioning about Teresa is that she does a lot of work with students being part of that community. That's the key word there. So it's not passive, and it's not sort of necessarily tutor-led. Yeah,
that's great. I think it's nice to have that different approach for you to consider. Okay, so we're going to now look at this topic, which was again quite highly requested by the delegates, on the topic of webinars and staff development. And just quickly in the text chat, one of Amy's style 30 seconds. How do you find webinars to attend? And if you're a learning technologist and you look after staff development, how do staff or other colleagues find webinars to attend? Okay, so email lists, that's right. So that tends to be Twitter, mailing lists, subscriptions to ones that have run well previously, just discussion groups. Okay, so quite interesting, mailing lists, forums. So it kind of feels like that you already have to be a member of something to be aware of these webinars. So we've often thought that we need to encourage everyone to bring along a colleague who's never done a webinar before to sit in next to you accessing a webinar, because I think that's the way to kind of increase uptake. And we found that works here at the university. I've introduced a few staff and they've independently accessed some of these webinars that we run. So thanks very much to everyone who's been recommending our webinars. Let's move on to the next page about poor uptake. Another 30 seconds. What reasons do you know for the poor uptake of webinars at your organization? So we all agree it's really good for free training for our colleagues, for ourselves. What are the key reasons for not getting more people taking up webinars? Yeah, no carrots, no stick. Yeah, maybe if you sign up and your face isn't there, it's more time slots. Yeah, okay. Not having the software. Sometimes people don't see the value and work priorities. I guess that some of these reasons are the same as people not turning up for face-to-face events as well. And I think lecturers are nervous about the technology. I think it's worth us running how to access webinars for your staff development type things. So thanks very much for your input there, guys. Next page. So this little resource here is just about thinking through webinars for training, for staff development, but also webinars as training. So if I try and prepare a webinar with a colleague, it's staff development for both of us, because we're both thinking through the design of the online session. So this is something I did with this lady, Anne Lefford, many years ago, and she started with not having attended a webinar before to having to run her own. So I took her through a process, and I've got this spreadsheet that details, in minute details, little things like inserting a mic and finding that the webinar tool still didn't pick it up as the input source. So there were lots of little things we had to overcome and practice with. So have a look at the spreadsheet, have a look at, listen to Anne's reflection. In terms of organizing and co-creating, I think Ron, Alistair, and I, we've done this for a couple of years now, and we definitely use this time as part of our staff development. We all learn something as we talk to each other and plan these sessions. So just the very act of inviting colleagues to co-present with you, if you're a staff developer, makes very good sense. If you're confident with running webinars, inviting a colleague who's never done something like that before is a very good staff development opportunity for them. And in terms of attracting audience, it's almost like the digital competencies thing, where to run a webinar successfully, you need to have like marketing skills, you need to have like some design skills, creating your resources, and even, a little bit of publicity skills. But apart from that, keeping your audience, the key thing is your pace, how interactive you make it. I think that's one key thing. And being more social constructivist, because I think people attend webinars, they really enjoy talking to each other in the chat. So on the next page, we're going to look at sticky webinars. What makes a sticky webinar? And Ron, if you don't mind picking that up and sticking it in the text chat. So in the text chat, if you click on the link that Ron has put in there, you can actually type into the answer garden that you see there, the gray pane. So where it says type your answer here. So the question is, what makes you attend a webinar or attend regularly? You've only got 40 characters. It's got to be a short phrase. Okay, that's good. If you have something to present, if the webinar topic's relevant to you, timely, I guess, would be another word. We sometimes, I think it should refresh, or else we have to keep refreshing, Ron.
I think it's refreshing.
Okay, so some people are saying it's, oh yeah, it's just not showing up on yours, Ron. Yeah, there you go. So how relevant it is to teaching, stuff I can take away and apply, fits my calendar. So I think on the whole, relevance is quite a high thing. Interesting topic is something that's the biggest fit. So these are things you can come back to and look at, when you're planning your next webinar. Is it a topic that hits people's interest? Is it going to be relevant to them? Will it link up to their roles? And will it fit their calendar? So maybe do a doodle poll before you run a webinar next time. Yeah. Okay. So after sticky, we have sustainable, because we're starting to talk about we can't keep making resources so that they're so time consuming to create. If we want to keep running these webinars, we have to do minimal creation and maximum interaction with the delegates, and we can co-create the learning while we're spending the time together. So this is an example of this particular guy, James Malucki. If you want to hop to the 19th slide, this is an example. He has peppered all the way through his slide share. He planned this webinar so that people were constantly answering questions and therefore co-creating the knowledge. So he didn't spend all his time presenting. He kind of put in the questions for people to discuss. And we've tried to do a little bit of that today, and that's our way of trying to be more social constructivist as well. Okay, so there's other things about sustainability. Obviously, it's like, the time it takes to create, the time it takes to kind of attract and draw and organize the webinar, and to kind of share the resources afterwards. That's quite time consuming as well. So these are other things that you need to kind of consider. And then last but not least, it's this idea of students running webinars. This is one particular case study which Ron has stuck in there for you, but this idea that, we run webinars, we deliver staff training, staff might run webinars for their students, and then the ultimate, if you like, is to organize for students to design and run webinars for each other. In doing so, they learn so much more, and at such a deeper level as well. So if you've got any, if you know of any case studies, if you like, or projects where students have run webinars, do stick them in the text chat, because that will be a useful resource for people to come back and read up and refer to. Okay. How are we doing for time?
We're doing very well. Yeah,
we're
that's
doing
why
okay. Yay.
the bird bell hasn't had to ring, so I can soon change that though. Yeah, in terms of further reading, we wanted you to be able to go away with a bit of an eclectic mix here. So I've divided some of our research into these 6 sections. So in terms of training teachers, training academics, there's some couple of nice case studies there that you can explore in your own time. They've got checklists, they've got different approaches that are worth doing. Then there's the pedagogical approaches, which where I was particularly interested in how does the affordance of a webinar tool allow you to do different kinds of pedagogy. Now, you'll certainly see some of that in Teresa McKinnon's case study, but there's some other examples here about, from small problem-based small group work, a lovely model there, a fish model that I've not seen before, peer learning, etc. But I was really interested in this next category down, the gender category. And being a male, I probably have some blind spots to this. What are they called? Unrecognized bias or something, where you don't even think of something being an issue. But that second one, are webinars better for women? There was a really interesting study on combining feminist pedagogy and transactional distance. I've never even come across transactional distance till I started reading through that. Really interesting, though, for you to look at, and that might be particularly interesting in some subjects where there's a gender imbalance, some of the STEM subjects, for example. But also, we try to take some non-European examples too. Very interesting example from Saudi Arabia, on the the teaching of webinar-based teaching for girls, because they're not allowed to have a male teacher teaching a group of women in the same room. But have a look at the kind of things that the women object to, or the things that they struggle with in the webinar delivery, and you find lots of the sorts of things that Amy was referring to, but in a different context. Sustainability, an obvious thing, but easy to forget that if we've got 39 people participating today and we all live in different parts of the country or world, none of us have had to fly anywhere. So a nice example there of how Bournemouth University put together a green course with very much a sense of wanting green credentials in it. Technically, very detailed study there from Jin Tan from Cardiff and latterly Yorkshire, I think, York, and some really nice very detailed look at the technical aspects that you might consider. And lastly, professional, in terms of employability and in terms of kind of thinking beyond the lecture theatre or the classroom. A couple of really interesting examples there. And I think we're still on time, so that's very good. I've just turned over exactly on time.
Okay, so that's great. And Fran has said, yeah, another benefit is bringing subject expertise in as and when needed as well. So yes, there's another great key benefit of webinars, isn't it? So yeah, you can see how there's this dilemma of whether a 1-hour webinar is too long, but trying to fit in the kind of things we want to discuss means that we soon run out of time. The 1 hour seems to go really, really fast. So along with webinars, what we like to do for the Future Teacher Project is to actually have these conferences where we meet face-to-face. The last one was in Norway in March. The one before that was here in York on the 9th of January. And our next one is in Belgium on the 23rd and 24th of May. Now, the conference itself is free if you can get yourself there on Eurostar. We're going to be there. And what we're going to do is we're going to live stream our next webinar. This is when we normally announce our next one. It's going to be the 23rd of May. And we're going to live stream Alistair's keynote from the Belgium conference. So you can kind of sign up, watch the webinar, obviously, which is kind of Alistair's keynote, and we'll interact with you in the chat. So it becomes a bit of a hybrid where Alistair's presenting to an audience, but we'll be there to actually take any questions of your questions and ask him the questions as well directly. Okay, so take a look at that in the resource. And then the other thing we like to promote as well is this idea of, for those of you who attend this series regularly, you'll have seen this. This is the kind of framework that we kind of build our webinars around, these topics. And it matches very well to the UK PSF and to even the ETF, the recent ETF have used this as well to build up their kind of competency framework. So this is the European one, a lot of very nice, simple statements. If you're supporting colleagues, it's one to look at for the kind of phrases and terminology that's very nice to pick up and use. Okay. So next up, Ron, do you want to talk about the journey and the fact that people can actually, apart from these webinars, we've kind of translated them into online journeys as well?
Yeah, it's worth expanding on that all of the partners involved in the project, so from Norway, from Belgium, from the Netherlands and us in the UK, have been busily working behind the scenes, not only on these webinars that we've delivered in each country, but also journeys, mini courses that complement and extend the topics of the webinars. So as well as that, our resources that you can find available in the same resource that you signed up to this webinar from, and all the talks and all the resources and recordings that we made available, there is this virtual learning environment, PEDIT, that's based in Norway, that we've assembled all of these journeys and extended them with activities and so on. And there's also a tool called a thermometer and then a compass. And the thermometer is the kind of survey where you can go in and answer questions about your current experience, and then follow links in the compass that is kind of dynamic based on your responses to the survey, that then direct you to the next journey you ought to explore based on your responses. And that's a kind of evolving and a kind of rotational way that you can navigate all the resources and courses. And it's also something you can repurpose and make your own in your own organizations. And one of the things that we're planning to do is not only use PEDIT, but remake all the journeys so that they can be downloaded as Moodle courses, for instance. And all of the resources and the Xerte resources we've made available will not only be available for sharing, but available for downloading and repurposing in your own copy of Xerte if you want to do that. And that's one of the reasons we use Xerte. So you'll find the links and so on here to be able to go and sign up and join those journeys. And this is a step-by-step guide as to how you would do that. So we welcome you and encourage you to do that. And at the end of it, you'll find a feedback form, if I go to the last slide, where you can provide us some feedback of those journeys as they evolve. And like I say, these cover all of the topics across the project, not just the topics that we've delivered during the Future Teacher Talks. Before we go, we do have a final activity for you, but we usually kind of display this first. So please do join our mailing list if you haven't, because that's where we'll publicise the availability of the recordings and the resources. And also, Lillian mentioned the END conference the conference in Belgium. We may broadcast other sessions from that conference, and we'll publicise them on the mailing list as well as probably Twitter. So follow us either on the mailing list or on Twitter, and we'll let you know if any of the additional sessions that we're going to be delivering in Belgium will be available and available to sign up in Zoom to just join us. Here's where you can register for that keynote that Alistair's doing. So you've got that link in your resource to click and open the Zoom page that will open here, and you can register specifically for that session. But as I say, we may do additional sessions as well during that 2-day conference. So our last activity for you, I'll just go to the last page. There's a note here about why we use Xerte and how we use Xerte, and there's a link to the learning object itself. But one thing before you go is, what one thing will you do as a result of what we've discussed today? And try to be as specific as you can. We appreciate that people say that they will explore the resources and topics further, but try to be more specific and give us one concrete example that you take away as an action to do to follow up on this. And we usually have an informal chat at this point as well, and we'll answer any further questions that you might want to post in the text chat.
That's great, Kate. Good to know that some of these tools that we've shared with you will be used further. Friends looking for an opportunity to present. I think we should grab her, get in touch. Okay. Thank you, Catherine. I love that. I love that. We'd love to hear if you kind of manage to take this further. And you know, this resource, there's no reason why this resource can't be shared with learners as well. If when they're doing their research for running webinars, there's no reason why you can't give them this resource, this webinar recording, and ask them to do their research that way so that they then run a better webinar themselves. Yes, bringing a colleague. Thank you. We love that. Oh, thank you. That's brilliant, Catherine. Advertising it to, yeah. Any student in kind of teacher education mode would benefit from kind of immersing themselves. A lot of our webinars are very much pedagogy-led, teaching and learning-led. And although we do like our learning technology focus because of the way it makes things more inclusive, we always return back to you know, learning theory principles and stuff like that.
I think it's worth, I spotted a couple of comments there where people have been struggling with the pace of the webinar. Yeah. And I think that's a very fair point. But I think one of the things to put it in the bigger context is that all of these webinars are the first stages of us putting together the learning journeys. And so by their nature, because the learning journeys are designed to take maybe 2 or 3 hours for people to do, clearly when we're preparing the content for that, we're taking 2 or 3 hours worth of content, which we shape up in the mind map. And then from the mind map, we then work out which elements of that are realistic to cover during the webinar. And I think we're probably, you know, I think hand on heart, we'd probably say we always try to cover more than is sensible quite often. But I think we're also very aware that we're dealing with the ultimate mixed ability groups, where there are people who are totally new to the topics very often, and there are people who are you know, full-time learning technologists, etc., who still want to come and still want to get something and give something back to it. So the only way that we've been able to cover both of those in a single session, obviously we can cover that very easily in a learning journey, but covering it in a single session and being able to have something for any of those audiences to take away is to go broad, to go fast, but also to ensure that the Xerte resource is there so that people can pick and choose the bits that they want to look at in more detail. But you know, your points are very well made, and I think one of the things you'll find from what Lillian was saying earlier, when this series ends, when the, you know, this stage of the Future Teacher production ends, we're going to be looking at continuing these kind of monthly type webinars in a much lower key way, and I think that will be the opportunity then, with background information already available, learning journeys already available. It'll be a chance for us then to have the kind of webinars that I think Debbie and was it Sarah we're talking about, where more time for people just to chat and to be slow paced.
I think it's worth picking up, sorry, Dan, it's worth picking up as well that we spend an awful lot of time making the resources as self-explanatory as possible so that you can visit the resource on its own without having attended the webinar or without having to review the webinar recording. And so it isn't just the kind of bullet point PowerPoints that you will often see in a lot of webinars. And that's why we do rush through very quickly, because we do know that, you know, that's a resource that you can revisit and consume a lot more info than we can possibly cover during the session. So it's always a balancing act.
Yeah, but I take everyone's points. I think when we created our very first webinar, we had that little argument, Alistair, between whether we were going to make it, if you like, cognitive constructivist or social constructivist.
Yeah.
How much were we going to create? And I was very much for let's just put one question up and just spend an hour working at that. But we also felt that people attend these because they know they're going to come away with an awareness of the rich amount of resource and research that Ron, Alistair and I put into this, as well as our guest speakers. So it's the first exposure to a huge world of information. So it's always worth coming anyway, even if it's kind of a tsunami of information, because then when you go away and access the recording or the actual learning object, the beauty is you can take the learning object apart for your staff and turn it into a 10-hour program if you needed to.
And talk about taking it apart, all these Xerti objects are OER, and if you have your own Xerti installation, you can literally take it apart and recontextualize it for your own people.
Thanks, Debbie. No, we totally agree with you. I was there to begin with as well, so don't feel bad. But yeah, so it's 2 o'clock. Normally we're quite strict about finishing the recording at 2 o'clock, aren't we, Ron?
Okay, I'll hit that stop button now then.